So, Russia blew up an old Soviet satellite and created hundreds of pieces of debris in low Earth orbit this week, forcing the entire crew of the International Space Station, including Russian cosmonauts, to board their respective lifeboat spacecraft in case the pieces would cross orbit with the ISS. Hello everybody and welcome! In this video we're going to talk about this test, why it was hugely irresponsible, how many others there have already been, and what other kinds of crazy space weapons there have been in the past. Let's start with the current test of a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, or ASAT for short. On November 15th, Russia sent up a missile to an old surveillance satellite from the Tselina family, designated Cosmos 1408, that had been dead in orbit since 1982. The missile hit its target, which burst into hundreds of pieces, which are now in their separate orbits ranging from 300 up to 1,100 kilometers in altitude above the Earth, with most of the pieces concentrated around 400 to 450 kilometers. This is of course an issue, because each of these fragments could potentially hit another satellite, turning it into another debris cloud, which then could hit another, and so on, until we have a cascade effect that culminates in that nail-biting scene from Gravity. The action was quickly condemned by the US military, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, EU Space Commissioner Thierry Breton, as well as many private space companies that would prefer that their space hardware be left in peace. The big problem with this test is that the pieces are spread out really far and also in a high enough orbit that it will take years and potentially decades for some of them to be slowed down by that minimal atmospheric drag that still exists that high up, so that the pieces can burn up on re-entry. In short, it's a complete mess. And I'll get back to the danger this poses a bit later. But first, we'll go back in time a little, because this was by far not the first time that weapons have been tested in space or that satellites have been shot down. Let's review what mad acts in the name of national defense have already been committed over the past decades. In March 2019, India conducted an ASAT test called Mission Shakti, which hit a test vehicle in a 300-kilometer orbit. The mission planners had the decency to hit the target from above, trying to spread the debris more into lower altitudes so that the pieces would burn up quicker. But some of them are still up there. In February 2008, the United States destroyed a non-functional military satellite designated USA-193. As official reason, it was stated that the satellite carried toxic hydrazine fuel on board and that it was destroyed to prevent that fuel from causing any harm back on Earth. In January 2007, China created 40,000 pieces of debris after destroying one of their old weather satellites, Fengyu 1C. Due to the high altitude of 865 kilometers, thousands of these pieces are still up there. One of them passed the ISS at a distance of just 6 kilometers in 2011. But hey, disregard for human life is par for the course when it comes to the Chinese and space. Let's wind the clock back even further. I'm old enough to remember US President Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes also called the Star Wars program, because it was said the sci-fi films inspired him to create it. Basically, the idea of SDI was to have weapons platforms in space and on the ground that could shoot down incoming Soviet nuclear missiles or disable enemy satellites. There were fantastic drawings of satellites shooting laser beams at each other in magazines of the time, and there were some crazy project ideas that I don't have the time to get into, unfortunately. But the US were not the first ones to send a laser weapon to space. That questionable honor falls to the Soviet Union, which produced Polyus, an 80-ton monster of a vehicle that contained a 1 megawatt carbon dioxide laser. It launched on May 1987 on the new Energia heavy launch vehicle and reached space, but not orbit. A software error led to Polyus messing up its orbital insertion burn, and it burned up above the Pacific. A few years before that, the US Air Force had already been testing anti-satellite weapons as part of their Air-Launched Miniature Vehicle (ALMV). This culminated in the ASM-135 ASAT missile that an F-15 fighter jet could carry and release during a maneuver called a supersonic zoom climb. There were 5 test launches between January 1984 and September 1986, but it never actually hit a real target. And we can go even further back to see weapons tested in space. The Soviet Almaz space stations were equipped with a 23mm autocannon, usually equipped at the tail end of a Tupolev Tu-22 bomber. And yes, they even fired it at a target satellite during the OPS-2 mission, which was publicly called Salyut 3 and in orbit between June 1974 and January 1975. By the way, Almaz and Polyus will be part of my Soviet space history series when I finally get around to finishing the last 2 episodes. If I ever do that, you will find links to those in the video description. So, already more than 4 decades ago, weapons were fired in space. But we can go even further back to the early beginnings of spaceflight in the 1950s and 1960s. That R-7 rocket that sent up Sputnik, it started its life as an intercontinental ballistic missile to send nuclear warheads from the Soviet Union to the USA, in case someone ever was insane enough to initiate World War III. And let's not kid ourselves. A lot of the achievements of human spaceflight were accelerated by the US's and the Soviet Union's need to one-up each other during the Cold War. We like to think that space should be kept for peaceful exploration and like to recite the words of the first moon landing that "we came in peace for all mankind." But the reality is that space has always been a domain of war, and it still is. Competing nations use space-based reconnaissance for all kinds of things, from espionage to direct conflict. Satellite imagery, for instance, is used to plan attacks on enemy positions. In addition to land, sea, air, and cyberspace, militaries around the world also recognize space as a warfighting domain. If you want to learn more about that, there's an interesting video on the subject by Smarter Everyday, I'll link in the description. So, if you know that your opponent has the capability to interfere with your operations from space, crippling those capabilities is a vital weapon in your arsenal. And Russia just let everyone know that they have such a weapon. Which should not come as a surprise to anyone, to be honest, based on the fact they were the first to shoot a gun in space. That makes this most recent test even more irresponsible in my opinion. Space debris is already a huge problem, and the ISS had to change its orbit multiple times to avoid collision over its long history. You see, things don't merely float in space, they race around the Earth at roughly 8,000 kilometers a second to stay in equilibrium with the planet's gravity well. Even the smallest piece at this kind of speeds would pierce the strongest armor. This is what it looks like when a 3mm diameter ball of aluminum hits spacecraft shielding at 7 kilometers a second. You don't want to be inside that spacecraft when that happens. The question remains what to do with all the debris up in space. United Launch Alliance CEO Tory Bruno had a very American response to this problem. Unless it is economically viable, cleaning up space debris is apparently off the agenda. I have a counter to that. Is keeping roads and railways intact economically viable? It's a trick question, of course, because you can't really put a price tag on a single fixed pothole. But keeping your infrastructure intact is an overall benefit for any society and as such enables businesses to thrive. I personally believe there should be an international effort led by governmental actions to keep space clean. Or at least not mess it up any further. There is already a UN committee on the peaceful uses of outer space, of which ironically all nations that have performed ASAT tests are part of. Its headquarters is here in my hometown of Vienna, Austria. Maybe I pay them a visit one day. There were drafts for treaties to ban space weapons, one even created by Russia in the 2000s, but nothing tangible came out of that until now. So Russia was not in violation of any international treaty when it launched its anti-satellite weapon. Aside from a few stern words, this will not have any consequences. Instead of messing up real space, those trigger-happy generals should play more Kerbal space program. They can blow up anything they like in there, without putting lives in danger.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.